2 years after a couple vanished, their dog reappeared, traumatized, injured, and holding the key to a horrifying secret. His loyalty would expose a darkness they never escaped, hidden deep within the unforgiving wilderness. The October chill had begun to settle over the small town of Harmony Creek, nestled precariously at the foothills of the vast Appalachian Range. 2 years, 24 months, 730 days since David and Karen Mitchell, seasoned hunters and familiar faces in the close-knit community, had walked into the dense northern woods with their loyal hound, Ranger, and vanished as if swallowed by the ancient mountains themselves. The initial flurry of activity, the desperate searches, the hushed theories, the grim-faced sheriff poring over maps, had long since dwindled, replaced by the quiet ache of an unsolved mystery. The case file, thick with unanswered questions and devoid of a single concrete lead, gathered dust on a shelf in the local precinct, a silent testament to a tragedy that time was slowly trying to erase. The Mitchells weren't just names on a missing persons report. David, with his booming laugh and encyclopedic knowledge of the woods, had been a volunteer firefighter and a mentor to many of the town's youth, teaching them tracking and survival skills. Karen, a talented artist who captured the rugged beauty of the Appalachians on canvas, was the gentle heart of their duo, her kindness as renowned as her venison stew. Their absence left a palpable void, a tear in the fabric of Harmony Creek that refused to mend. Whispers still circulated in hushed tones at the local diner and the general store. Some spoke of wild animals, a sudden, brutal encounter. Others, their voices lower, hinted at something more sinister, the shadowy figures rumored to inhabit the deep wilderness, those who lived by their own laws, far from the reach of civilization. Tales of bootleggers and hermits, fiercely protective of their isolation, had always been a part of Appalachian folklore, but the Mitchells' disappearance lent these stories a chilling new relevance. Yet, with no evidence, these remained just that, whispers in the encroaching darkness. Then, on a Tuesday morning, as the first rays of a hesitant sun pierced the autumn mist, something impossible happened. Old Man Hemlock, a reclusive figure himself who lived on the very edge of the woods, was checking his traps when he saw it, a gaunt, limping shape staggering out from the tree line. It was Ranger. The dog was a ghost of his former self. Once a robust, muscular hound, his ribs now protruded sharply beneath a matted, filthy coat. His left foreleg was cruelly twisted at an unnatural angle, an old injury that had clearly never been tended. Deep, jagged scars crisscrossed his muzzle and flanks, some faded white with time, others still an angry pink. But it was his eyes that struck Hemlock to the core, wide with a haunted, vacant look, as if he'd witnessed horrors best left unseen. And around his neck, biting into the raw, irritated skin, was a crudely fashioned collar made of thick, weathered leather, fastened with a rusty buckle, a collar the Mitchells would never have used. News of Ranger's return spread through Harmony Creek like wildfire. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary face now bore the permanent etchings of the Mitchell case, was at Hemlock's cabin within the hour. The sight of the dog, whimpering softly as the town veterinarian, Doc Simmons, gently examined him, stirred a maelstrom of emotions in Brody, a surge of incredulous hope, quickly tempered by a grim foreboding. 2 years. Where had the dog been? And more importantly, what had he endured? Doc Simmons' initial assessment was bleak. Ranger was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from a host of infections. The leg injury was old, improperly healed, and would likely leave him with a permanent limp. The scars told a story of conflict, of struggles for survival. The collar, however, was the most disturbing element. It was a restraint, clear and simple. Someone had kept Ranger, and not with any kindness. As Doc Simmons worked, carefully cleaning Ranger's wounds and administering fluids, the dog remained largely unresponsive, his eyes dull. But then, as Brody knelt beside him, speaking in a low, soothing voice, a flicker of recognition, a faint tremor ran through the animal. Ranger lifted his head, his gaze momentarily clearing, and let out a soft, almost inaudible whine, a sound so filled with pain and longing that it made Brody's chest ache. He'd seen that look in the eyes of traumatized victims before, human victims. The return of Ranger ripped open old wounds in Harmony Creek, but it also ignited a spark. If the dog could survive, could find his way back after so long, then perhaps there was still a chance. Perhaps the Mitchells, or at least the truth of what happened to them, wasn't lost forever in the unforgiving wilderness. The dog was a witness, a living, breathing piece of evidence in a case that had gone cold. The questions that had haunted the town for 2 long years resurfaced with a desperate urgency. What happened to David and Karen Mitchell? And what secrets did Ranger hold in the silent, haunted depths of his eyes? The forest had given back one of its lost, but in doing so, it had only deepened the enigma, tightening the knot of fear and uncertainty that had gripped Harmony Creek since that fateful October day. The silence of the mountains suddenly seemed less like an ending and more like a bated breath. The news of Ranger's return did more than just reopen a painful chapter for Harmony Creek. It brought David and Karen Mitchell back to the forefront of everyone's minds, their presence as vivid and immediate, as if they had only just stepped into the woods. Before the mystery, before the hushed fear, they were simply Dave and Karen, integral threads in the town's tapestry. David Mitchell was a man carved from the very mountains he loved, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from years of working with timber and tending to his small farm. He possessed an easy strength that commanded respect without demanding it. His laughter, a deep, rumbling sound, was a frequent echo in the town's main street, particularly on Saturday mornings when he'd share coffee and tall tales with the other regulars at Maggie's Diner. He knew the Appalachian trails like the lines on his palm, could read the forest's subtle language, a broken twig here, a disturbed patch of moss there, with an accuracy that astounded even seasoned trackers. It was this expertise that made his disappearance all the more baffling. David wasn't a novice, he wasn't reckless. He understood the wilderness, its beauty, and its perils. He had been a volunteer firefighter for 15 years, often the first to charge into danger, the last to leave. He'd taught countless local kids about hunting ethics, about respecting the land, about how to find their way home if they ever got lost. The irony of his own fate was a bitter pill for the community to swallow. Karen Mitchell was the quiet counterbalance to David's robust energy. With a gentle smile that could soothe the most frayed nerves and eyes that seemed to absorb the world's colors, she was an artist, her chosen medium the untamed landscapes that surrounded them. Her studio, a small light-filled room at the back of their modest home, was a sanctuary filled with canvases capturing the fleeting moods of the mountains, a dawn mist clinging to the valleys, the fiery blaze of autumn leaves, the stark silhouette of winter trees against a steel-gray sky. She volunteered at the town library, organizing children's story hours, her soft voice bringing tales of adventure and wonder to life. Her garden was legendary, a riot of color and fragrance that supplied half the town with fresh flowers and vegetables. Karen's kindness was her hallmark. She was the one people turned to for a sympathetic ear, for a word of comfort, for a pot of her famous venison stew when life dealt a harsh blow. Together, David and Karen were more than the sum of their parts. Their love story was a quiet epic, unfolding over 2 decades in the rhythms of small-town life. They were a team, whether it was navigating the treacherous trails of the high country or the simple challenges of daily existence. Their house, a cozy log cabin set back from the road, was a haven of warmth and hospitality. The scent of wood smoke from their chimney and Karen's baking often mingled in the crisp mountain air. Their absence wasn't just a missing couple, it was a dimming of the town's light, a silencing of its laughter, a chilling of its warmth. The initial search, 2 years prior, had been extensive, almost frantic. Sheriff Brody, then newer to his role, had coordinated efforts involving state police, search and rescue teams from 3 counties, and dozens of local volunteers, many of whom David had personally mentored. They'd gridded the northern sector, the area David had mentioned he and Karen were heading to for a 3-day hunting trip. They'd found their truck parked at the trailhead, locked, with no signs of disturbance. Inside, a half-eaten sandwich and a thermos of still warm coffee spoke of a normal beginning to their excursion. But beyond that, the trail went cold with an almost supernatural abruptness. No footprints, no discarded equipment, no sign of a struggle. Ranger, who had accompanied them, was also missing, leading to the early, hopeful theory that perhaps the dog, with his keen senses, might lead them to the Mitchells if they were injured. That hope had slowly withered with each passing day. The forest, usually a source of sustenance and solace for the people of Harmony Creek, had become a formidable, silent adversary. It guarded its secrets jealously, Helicopters equipped with thermal imagers found nothing but the dense canopy. K9 units, brought in from afar, lost sense within a few hundred yards of the Mitchell's truck, their frustration a mirror of the human searchers. The terrain was brutal. Steep ravines, thick undergrowth, hidden caves, and abandoned mine shafts from a bygone era. Every searcher knew that a simple misstep, a sudden fall, could have dire consequences. But for two experienced individuals like David and Karen, and a capable dog like Ranger, to vanish so completely without a trace defied all logical explanation. The discovery of Ranger, now, 2 years later, was the first significant break, if one could call it that. As Doc Simmons continued his care of the traumatized animal, he made another discovery, one that sent a fresh wave of unease through Sheriff Brody. Embedded deep within one of the older, partially healed scars on Ranger's flank, almost invisible beneath the matted fur, was a tiny metallic fragment. It was too small to identify with the naked eye, but it was definitely not organic. Doc Simmons carefully extracted it, placing the minuscule shard into a sterile evidence bag. "This isn't from a thorn or a rock, Sheriff," he said, his voice grave. "This looks like shrapnel, or maybe a piece of a projectile. And judging by the way the scar tissue has formed around where it was, it's been in there a long time, probably since around the time he went missing." This changed things. The crude collar suggested captivity, but this metallic fragment hinted at something more violent, an event that had injured Ranger, an event that might have directly involved the Mitchells. It wasn't the conclusive proof Brody desperately needed, but it was a tangible piece of the puzzle, something more than just Ranger's emaciated state and haunted eyes. It pointed away from a simple case of getting lost or an unfortunate animal attack. It steered the investigation, now revived, towards a human element, a confrontation. The loss of David and Karen was not just a local tragedy. It was the loss of accumulated wisdom, of kindness, of community spirit. It was the empty chair at the diner, the unpainted canvas, the silent fire station, the overgrown garden. Ranger's return, bearing the physical and emotional scars of an unknown ordeal, and now this metallic fragment, forced Harmony Creek to confront not just what they had lost, but the chilling possibility of how it had been taken from them. The mountains held their breath, and the echo of absence resonated with a new, sharper pain, a pain now tinged with the cold dread of malevolence. The return of Ranger, coupled with the ominous metallic fragment extracted from his flank, should have been a clarion call, a jolt to reawaken the dormant investigative machinery beyond Harmony Creek. Sheriff Brody certainly treated it as such. He spent the better part of a day on the phone, first with the State Police District headquarters, then attempting to reach the FBI agent who had briefly consulted on the case 2 years prior. The responses he received were a disheartening tapestry of bureaucratic procedure, thinly veiled skepticism, and the unmistakable chill of a system that had long since relegated the Mitchell case to its cold archives. Captain Miller of the State Police, a man Brody remembered as being officiously detached even during the initial, frantic days of the search, was particularly dismissive. "A dog? Brody? That's your new lead after 2 years? Ranger, wasn't it?" Miller's voice crackled over the line, devoid of any genuine interest. "Animals wander. They get hurt. As for this, metal sliver? Could be anything. A piece of an old trap, a bit of scrap from illegal dumping. You know what those woods are like." Brody, clutching the small evidence bag containing the fragment, felt a familiar surge of frustration. "With all due respect, Captain," he countered, keeping his voice even despite the rising irritation, "this dog was missing for 2 years, the same 2 years as his owners. He returns emaciated, with a healed but severe leg injury, multiple scars, and a crude leather collar indicating captivity. This fragment was embedded in him, under old scar tissue. It suggests a violent encounter, not just a run-in with a rusty fence." There was a sigh on the other end of the line. "Look, Sheriff, we expended considerable resources on the Mitchell case. Manpower, air support, K9 units. We found nothing. The official assessment, as you know, leaned towards them succumbing to the elements or an animal attack in an unsearchable area. Tragic, yes, but not uncommon in that kind of terrain. But the dog, Miller, the dog didn't just succumb to the elements and then decide to come home 2 years later with evidence of mistreatment on him. Someone had him. Someone hurt him. Perhaps, Miller conceded, his tone suggesting he was merely placating the small-town sheriff, and perhaps he escaped from some backwoods recluse who keeps a few dogs too many. It doesn't automatically connect to the Mitchells' disappearance in a way that warrants reopening a full-scale state-level investigation. We have active cases, Brody. Fresh, violent crimes, drug trafficking, a backlog that would choke a horse, unless you can provide something more definitive. Something directly linking this dog's condition, or this fragment to David and Karen Mitchell, or a clear indication of foul play against them. The unspoken end to that sentence hung heavy. Don't waste our time. The conversation with the FBI liaison office was even more perfunctory. Agent Davies, the original consultant, had been transferred. Her replacement, a brisk-sounding Agent Sterling, listened with cool efficiency, took notes, and promised to review the supplementary information when Brody faxed it over. The implication was clear. The Mitchell file was buried deep, and it would take something far more earth-shattering than a return dog to excavate it. The system, it seemed, had moved on. The initial flurry of activity, the shared sense of urgency, had faded with the passing seasons, replaced by statistical probabilities and resource allocation formulas. David and Karen Mitchell were now just names in a database, their disappearance a closed chapter for the wider law enforcement community. The injustice of it gnawed at Brody. He was a part of that system, yet he felt profoundly alienated by its indifference. Harmony Creek, however, did not have the luxury of such detachment. For the townsfolk, Ranger's return was a raw, visceral event. Hope, fear, and anger churned in the local coffee shop, the feed store, and the pews of the community church. The sight of the limping, scarred dog being walked tentatively by Doc Simmons or his assistant was a constant, painful reminder. Many remembered David's booming laugh when he'd first brought a clumsy ranger puppy to the town fair, or Karen gently sketching the dog as he slept by their fireplace. The crude collar Ranger wore was passed around, felt, and examined with grim faces. It spoke of a cruelty that felt personal to everyone. The local newspaper, the Harmony Creek Herald, a weekly publication run by the elderly and well-meaning Clara Hoskins, did its best. Clara, who had taught both David and Karen in Sunday school, splashed Ranger's story across the front page, complete with a blurry photo of the dog and a plea for any information. But the Herald had a circulation of less than 1,000. Attempts to interest larger regional news outlets were met with polite disinterest, or a request for a more sensational angle. A Dog Finds Its Way Home story was mildly heartwarming. A 2-year-old missing persons case, without new dramatic human evidence, was old news. The media, like the authorities, seemed to require a louder, more shocking stimulus. This systemic shrug, this quiet dismissal, fueled a simmering resentment in Harmony Creek. There were murmurs that if the Mitchells had been wealthy or politically connected, the search would never have truly ended. The case would never have been allowed to grow so cold. This wasn't entirely fair. Brody knew the initial efforts had been genuine, but he understood the sentiment. It felt like David and Karen, good, hard-working, ordinary people, had been forgotten by everyone except their own. Brody managed to get the metallic fragment sent to the state crime lab, but it was with no promise of expedited analysis. It joined a queue, another piece of potential evidence in a long line of other, more pressing items from fresher, hotter cases. He made it clear that this was potentially linked to a double homicide, not just a missing persons case, hoping to escalate its priority, but without a body or a direct confession. His assertion was just that, an assertion. Adding to the town's unease and Brody's frustration were the subtle but disturbing changes in Ranger. The dog was mostly listless, still deeply traumatized, but occasionally a sound or a scent would trigger a strange reaction. The distant rumble of a logging truck on the highway once sent him into a fit of trembling, his whines sharp and terrified, until he managed to drag himself under the porch of Doc Simmons's clinic, refusing to emerge for hours. Another time, Old Man Hemlock, visiting the dog, had been wearing a heavy canvas jacket, similar to what hunters might wear. Ranger, upon catching the scent or sight of it, had let out a low, guttural growl, a sound completely out of character for the once gentle hound, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth in a silent snarl before he visibly forced himself down, shivering. These reactions were like fleeting, distorted glimpses into a nightmare. They hinted at memories, at experiences Ranger couldn't articulate, but which were clearly etched into his psyche. They were clues, Brody felt, as vital as any fingerprint or DNA sample, if only he could understand them. But the system wasn't equipped to interpret the trauma of a dog. The system needed hard facts, verifiable data, the kind of evidence that was still, maddeningly, locked away in the silent, unforgiving wilderness, or perhaps in the minds of those who had learned to live beyond the reach of the law. The silence from the authorities was a heavy weight, pressing down on Harmony Creek, a silence that felt increasingly like an accomplice to the crime itself. Weeks bled into a month since Ranger's return. The initial shockwave had subsided, replaced by a tense, watchful quiet in Harmony Creek. Ranger, under Doc Simmons' diligent care and the watchful eye of Sheriff Brody, was slowly regaining physical strength. His limp was permanent, a crooked punctuation mark to an unknown sentence, but his coat began to regain some of its lost luster, and the haunted vacancy in his eyes sometimes gave way to fleeting moments of his old self, a soft nudge for a gentle scratch behind the ears, a flicker of interest in a passing squirrel. These moments were precious, hard-won, but with physical healing came a more pronounced sensitivity to his surroundings, and the triggers that sent him spiraling into fear, or more rarely a low, ominous aggression, became sharper, more defined. Brody, frustrated by the bureaucratic inertia from state authorities, began his own quiet, methodical investigation, with Ranger as his reluctant, silent partner. He started taking the dog on short, leashed walks, initially just around Doc Simmons' clinic, then gradually extending them towards the outskirts of town, always watching, always noting. The fear of loud engines, especially those of larger trucks or ATVs, remained profound. The rumble of a diesel engine would make Ranger cower, his body pressed low to the ground, a pitiful whine escaping his throat. Brody noted this wasn't just any engine. Small passenger cars or the familiar purr of his own cruiser barely registered. It was the deeper, more powerful growl of heavy-duty vehicles that undid the dog. One crisp November afternoon, a convoy of logging trucks, their beds laden with felled giants from the state forest further south, thundered down the main highway that skirted Harmony Creek. Ranger, who had been calmly sniffing a patch of frost-covered grass near the edge of Brody's property, suddenly went rigid. He didn't just cower, he bolted, yanking the leash from Brody's surprised grasp and scrambling under the sheriff's old pickup, trembling violently. It took Brody nearly an hour and a good portion of a leftover chicken sandwich to coax him out. The intensity of the reaction was startling. Another pattern began to emerge. Ranger showed a distinct aversion to anything that smelled strongly of pine, resin, grease, and cheap, harsh tobacco, a combination often associated with makeshift logging operations or the kind of rough-living individuals who sometimes set up temporary camps deep in the less accessible parts of the woods. Brody discovered this when he borrowed an old, stained hunting jacket from Jedediah Jed Franks, a retired timberman who'd been part of the original search party. Jed was a heavy smoker of hand-rolled cigarettes and had spent his life around pine and machinery. The moment Brody brought the jacket near Ranger, the dog recoiled, a growl rumbling in his chest, his hackles visibly raised. He backed away, barking, a harsh, desperate sound that was more alarm than aggression. Then there was the incident at Miller's Hardware. Brody had taken Ranger there, hoping the familiar sense of grain, tools, and local townsfolk might be comforting. For a while it seemed to be working. Ranger was cautiously accepting pats from customers who remembered him. Then, a man, a stranger to Brody, dressed in well-worn overalls and carrying a can of chain oil, walked down the aisle. Ranger froze. His body stiffened, his head dropped low, and a sound unlike anything Brody had heard from him before, a soft, guttural, almost continuous moan of pure terror, emanated from the dog. He didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't try to flee. He simply stared, transfixed by the man, his entire body shaking. The man, oblivious, paid for his oil and left. Ranger remained frozen for several minutes afterwards, and it took all of Brody's reassuring murmurs to bring him back. Brody discreetly inquired about the man. He was a transient worker, part of a crew clearing some land for a new development miles out of county, just passing through. Nothing overtly suspicious, yet Ranger's reaction was visceral. The metallic fragment remained a frustrating dead end for the time being. The state lab had finally sent back a preliminary report. Ferrous metal, likely a fragment of a hardened steel projectile, possibly from a high-velocity rifle round, or a piece of shrapnel from a homemade explosive device, too deformed for precise ballistics. Further analysis pending, but significantly delayed due to caseload. It was just enough to confirm Brody's suspicions of violence, but not enough to point any fingers or galvanize further official action. Homemade explosive device. The phrase chilled him. It spoke of a level of ruthlessness and sophistication beyond opportunistic poaching or a random encounter gone wrong. The turning point, subtle yet significant, came during a visit to the Mitchells' now silent, cold cabin. Brody had obtained permission from Karen's sister, who lived several states away and was the couple's next of kin, to access the property. He'd hoped something there, a familiar scent, an old toy, might unlock a more specific memory in Ranger. He led the dog through the house. Ranger was subdued, sniffing hee-hee smells, occasionally whining softly, especially in Karen's art studio, where a faint scent of turpentine and dried flowers still lingered. He nuzzled a discarded pair of David's old work boots by the back door, a brief, mournful gesture. Then, Brody led him out to the dilapidated shed at the back of the property where David had kept his hunting gear, tools, and his old, seldom-used ATV. The ATV was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. As they approached the shed, Ranger, who had been walking with a semblance of calm, suddenly stopped. His ears perked. He sniffed the air, then the ground, then the air again, his body tensing. He let out a low whimper. Then, to Brody's astonishment, he began to pull on the leash, not away from the shed in fear, but towards it, with a new, urgent energy. Inside, the shed was musty and dim. Ranger ignored the neatly hung hunting rifles. David had always been meticulous about gun safety. He bypassed the stacks of firewood and the workbench. Instead, he went straight to a dark corner, almost hidden behind the bulky ATV. There, half buried under a pile of old tarpaulins and discarded engine parts, was a length of rusted, heavy-gauge chain, and next to it, a crudely sawn-off metal stake, the kind used for tethering large animals or securing traps in the deep woods. Ranger began to paw at the chain, whining, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He nudged it with his nose, then looked up at Brody, his eyes for the first time filled not with vacant fear, but with a desperate, pleading intelligence. He pawed at it again more insistently. Brody knelt, his heart pounding. The chain was thick, much heavier than anything needed for a dog like Ranger. It looked disturbingly similar in crude strength to the leather collar Ranger had been found wearing. He carefully pulled the tarpaulins aside. Underneath, the packed earth was disturbed, and there, glinting dully in the dim light filtering through a grimy window pane, was something small and metallic. Brody picked it up. It was a spent point, .22 caliber shell casing, common enough, but not the type David typically used for hunting. More significantly, pressed into the dirt beside where the casing lay, almost invisible, was a faint, partial imprint. It looked like the edge of a boot heel, a distinctive, aggressive tread pattern he didn't recognize from David's boots. Ranger was now intensely focused on a particular spot on the wooden wall of the shed, sniffing, whining, even scratching lightly at the planks. Brody ran his hand over the rough wood. He felt nothing unusual at first, then, his fingers brushed against it. A tiny, almost imperceptible splinter of metal snagged in the wood fibers at about chest height. He carefully worked it free. It was another fragment, smaller than the one from Ranger's flank, but undeniably metallic. It wasn't a full memory, not a coherent narrative, but it was a scene, a chain, a stake, a strange shell casing, a boot print, a metallic shard in the wall. Ranger was showing him something. Something had happened here, in this shed, or had involved items from this shed. The dog's fear of certain engine sounds, certain smells, now seemed to coalesce around this place. Had the Mitchells been confronted here? Had Ranger been chained here while something terrible unfolded? The questions were agonizing, but for the first time, Brody felt they were not just shouting into the void. Ranger, in his own wounded way, was beginning to whisper the answers, and the whispers were terrifying. The discoveries in the Mitchells' shed galvanized Sheriff Brody. The crude chain, the heavy stake, the scent, .22 shell casing, the aggressive boot print, and the tiny metal sliver embedded in the wood. These were no longer disparate, silent objects. They were a nascent chorus, whispering of a dark event that had transpired on the Mitchells' own property. He photographed everything meticulously, took a plaster cast of the partial boot print, and carefully bagged the new metal fragment and the shell casing, dispatching them to the state lab with a more urgent request, citing potential links to the previous evidence from Ranger. This time, he didn't just ask. He drove the evidence to the regional state police barracks himself and had a face-to-face, albeit terse, conversation with a detective in their violent crimes unit, emphasizing the possibility of a prolonged captivity and a violent confrontation. The detective, a younger man named Rourke, seemed marginally more engaged than Captain Miller, promising to personally walk it over to the lab guys. While waiting, Brody focused on the boot print. It was his most immediate, tangible lead. Harmony Creek wasn't a large town, but the surrounding woods were vast, attracting hunters, loggers, hikers, and less identifiable individuals. He first consulted with Jed Franks, the old timberman. Jed, peering at the photo and the cast through his thick glasses, rubbed his grizzled jaw. "That ain't no standard logger's boot, Brody. Most of us wear steel toes with a specific grip for soft earth and timber. This treads deep, aggressive, made for rough, rocky terrain maybe, or for kicking down doors," he added grimly. "Seen similar on some of them out-of-state contract crews that come in for clear-cutting way back when. The kind that don't talk much." Brody then took the information to Tracker Thompson, a reclusive but legendary figure in Harmony Creek, who knew the Appalachians better than anyone still living. Thompson, a Cherokee descendant, lived in a small cabin several miles up a winding dirt track. He rarely came to town, but he had assisted in countless searches over the decades. He examined the cast with unnerving stillness, his dark eyes missing nothing. After a long silence he spoke, his voice raspy from disuse. Cascade XT model, discontinued. About 3-4 years back. Good boot. Too good for some. You recognize the make?" Brody pressed, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "Sold 'em for a season at the old outfitter's store over in Raven Gap before it burned down. Mostly bought by serious backcountry hunters, or folks who didn't want to be found. Had a unique sole pattern, that one. Supposed to leave less of a distinct trail, ironically." Thompson paused, then added, "There was a man, or a group of men, used to come through Raven Gap, buy supplies in bulk. Cash only, quiet, wore boots like that. Haven't seen 'em in years, not since before your trouble with the Mitchells." Raven Gap. The name struck a chord. It was a semi-abandoned mining settlement deeper in the mountains, northwest of where the Mitchells had parked their truck, notorious for being a difficult, almost inaccessible area. It had been on the periphery of the initial search grid, but deemed too remote and treacherous for a couple on a 3-day hunt to have ventured into. Brody also intensified his observation of Ranger's reactions. He drove Ranger slowly past various locations, noting the dog's responses. The town itself, the main roads, anxious but manageable. But as he drove north on the old logging access road, the one that eventually branched off towards the general direction of Raven Gap, Ranger's distress escalated dramatically. The dog began to pant heavily, his eyes darting. When they passed a long-abandoned, dilapidated way station, once used by logging companies decades ago, Ranger lunged against his restraints in the back of the cruiser, barking frantically, a raw, terrified sound. Brody pulled over, his own heart hammering. The way station was little more than a collapsing shack and a rusted platform scale, overgrown with weeds, but it was on the route towards Raven Gap. The pieces were beginning to align, forming a disturbing mosaic. The Cascade XT bootprint, the type favored by secretive individuals, Ranger's intense fear associated with the route towards Raven Gap and the old way station. The mention from the lab of a homemade explosive device in relation to the fragment from Ranger's flank resonated ominously with the idea of a clandestine operation. Then Detective Rourke called from State Police. "Sheriff Brody, you might want to come in. The fragment from the shed wall, it's a match to the one from your dog. Same unusual steel alloy, same microscopic striations. Lab boys say they're almost certainly from the same source object, which shattered, and that .22 casing from the shed. It's from a rifle, not a handgun. Firing pin marks are a bit unique. We're running it through Nibin, but no hits so far. The interesting thing is the residue inside the casing. Alongside the gunpowder traces, there's a faint trace of, get this, anhydrous ammonia. Anhydrous ammonia. Brody felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was a common farm fertilizer, yes, but it was also a key ingredient in the illicit manufacture of methamphetamine. Suddenly, the homemade explosive device theory took on a new, terrifying dimension. Meth labs were notorious for booby traps and a volatile, violent culture. The convergence of evidence was undeniable. The Mitchells hadn't just gotten lost. They hadn't just been the victims of random hermits. They had likely stumbled upon something far more organized, far more dangerous, operating in the remote, forgotten corners of the Appalachians, an operation that had a presence, or at least a footprint, right there at their shed. The chain, the stake, perhaps Ranger had been tethered there, a witness, while the Mitchells were confronted, possibly subdued, before being taken. The shot fired from the Edo, 22, the shattering metal. Was it a warning shot? A struggle? This was the twist, the sickening lurch in the narrative. The enemy wasn't just the faceless wilderness or shadowy, reclusive figures. It was a criminal enterprise with the means and ruthlessness to make two people, and their dog, disappear. An enterprise whose activities, the production of meth, explained the strange chemical traces, the potential for explosives, and the violent reaction to discovery. Brody knew he couldn't wait for the full weight of the state machinery to slowly grind into action. He had enough now to act more decisively. Raven Gap and the abandoned way station were no longer just points on a map. They were glaring red flags. He thought of David and Karen, their love for the woods, their inherent decency. The idea of them falling prey to such sordid, vicious criminality filled him with a cold fury. He drove to Doc Simmons' clinic. Ranger was dozing in a patch of sunlight. Brody knelt beside him. "Ranger," he said softly, I think I'm starting to understand what you've been trying to tell me." The dog opened his eyes, looked at Brody, and let out a soft whine, nudging his hand. It wasn't a gesture of fear this time, but something akin to weary acknowledgement. The next morning, before dawn, armed with this new, terrifying theory and a warrant to search the area around the abandoned way station and extend towards Raven Gap, Brody, along with 2 deputies he trusted implicitly and equipped for rough terrain and potential confrontation, headed north. He left Ranger in the care of Doc Simmons' assistant, knowing the dog had already endured more than enough. He didn't know what they would find, but the silence of the mountains no longer felt empty. It felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. The thread Ranger had brought back from the brink was unraveling, and it was leading into the heart of a darkness far deeper than Harmony Creek had ever imagined. The investigation had just become infinitely more dangerous. The pre-dawn air was biting as Sheriff Brody, flanked by Deputies Calloway and young Miller, no relation to the dismissive state police captain, navigated the narrow, rutted track leading towards the abandoned way station. The forest was a black, silent behemoth around them, the only sounds their own hushed movements and the crunch of frosted leaves under their boots. Brody had chosen this approach carefully, on foot for the last 2 miles, leaving their cruiser concealed well back, to avoid alerting anyone who might still be in the vicinity. Every instinct, honed by years in law enforcement and sharpened by Ranger's visceral reactions, told him they were walking into the heart of something deeply wrong. The way station, when they reached it, was even more derelict than Brody remembered from his brief drive-by with Ranger. The shack sagged, its windows dark, gaping holes. The massive platform scale was rusted solid, tilted at an angle, but it wasn't the decay that caught Brody's attention. It was the faint, almost invisible path leading away from the back of the shack, deeper into the woods, towards the forbidding slopes that climbed towards Raven Gap. It wasn't a deer trail. It was too regular, with subtle signs of human passage, a recently broken branch here, a scuff mark on a rock there. And permeating the air, overriding the natural scent of pine and damp earth, was a faint, acrid chemical odor, the kind that reminded Brody of the residue found in the .22 casing, anhydrous ammonia, or something equally noxious. "Masks on," Brody ordered, his voice low. They donned the tactical gas masks they'd brought. Calloway, a stout, experienced deputy, took point, his shotgun held ready. Miller, younger but steady, covered their rear. Brody, armed with his service pistol and a high-powered flashlight, despite the slowly graying dawn, followed Calloway. The trail wound upwards for another half-mile, becoming steeper and more treacherous. Then, Calloway raised a hand, signaling a halt. He pointed. Through a dense thicket of rhododendrons they could see it, a low, camouflaged structure, part lean, part dugout, built into the side of a steep hill. A thin, rusty stovepipe protruded crookedly from its roof, emitting no smoke now, but the chemical smell was stronger here, almost gagging even through the masks. Several empty plastic drums, the kind used for industrial chemicals, were haphazardly strewn nearby, along with piles of discarded pseudoephedrine blister packs, the telltale refuse of a meth lab. This was it, the source of the darkness that had swallowed the Mitchells. They approached with extreme caution, aware of the potential for booby traps. The place had an air of recent, hasty abandonment. A dirty tarpaulin served as a makeshift door. Calloway pushed it aside with the barrel of his shotgun. Inside, the scene was one of chaotic squalor. Makeshift tables held a disturbing array of beakers, tubing, stained plastic containers, and portable propane burners. The floor was littered with trash, empty food cans, and more chemical paraphernalia. But what seized Brody's attention were two things. First, near one of the tables, was a pair of discarded Cascade XT work boots, caked in mud and what looked like dark, dried stains. Their tread pattern was an exact match to the cast Brody had taken from the Mitchells' shed. Second, in a cleared area at the back of the cramped space, was a crude wooden pen, barely large enough for a man to lie down in. And beside it, half buried in the dirt floor, was a faded, mud-stained orange hunting vest. Brody felt his breath catch. He recognized it. It was David Mitchell's, Teebs. He had seen Karen mend a tear in that very vest a few years back. A thorough, grim search of the immediate area around the lab yielded more. Behind the structure, in a shallow, hastily dug pit concealed by branches, they found them, David and Karen Mitchell. They had been dead a long time. There were no overt signs of a prolonged struggle at this final site. Their bodies were wrapped in old tarps, buried together. The cause of death wouldn't be certain until the medical examiner's report, but Brody suspected they had been executed, silenced witnesses to an operation they were never meant to see. The .22 casing found in their shed now screamed of that initial, terrifying confrontation. Perhaps David had tried to defend them, or a warning shot had been fired, leading to their capture. The metal fragments, Brody now surmised, were likely from a crude alarm or a booby trap near the lab or on one of its access trails, something Ranger might have triggered or been caught in during the initial incident or a later escape attempt. It explained the old, severe injury to his leg and the shrapnel embedded in his flank. He had been there. He had been a victim, too. While Calloway and Miller secured the scene and began the grim task of documentation, Brody found a relatively undisturbed area a short distance away and made the call to state police. This time, there was no skepticism in Captain Miller's voice, only a shocked, somber tone as Brody detailed the discovery. A full forensic team and additional units were dispatched immediately. Evidence found at the lab, including fingerprints on some of the equipment and a discarded wallet with an out-of-state ID, likely stolen but a lead nonetheless, pointed towards at least 3 individuals. The Cascade XT boot suggested one of them was the man Tracker Thompson had described. The scene indicated they had cleared out quickly, but not carefully enough. They were running, but they had left a trail. The news hit Harmony Creek like a physical blow, a confirmation of their worst fears, yet also a strange, terrible kind of relief. The not knowing had been a corrosive acid. Now there was a dreadful certainty. A town-wide memorial service was held for David and Karen, a poignant outpouring of grief and shared remembrance. Their ashes, as per Karen's sister's wishes, would eventually be scattered in a protected part of the Appalachians they had so loved, a place far from the tainted ground where their lives had been stolen. The investigation, now a major multi-agency effort, continued for months. One of the suspects, identified through the ID and fingerprints, was apprehended trying to cross the border into Mexico. He eventually confessed, implicating 2 others, one of whom was later killed in a shootout with authorities in another state while resisting arrest. The third, the presumed wearer of the Cascade boots, and likely the operation's linchpin, remained a ghost, a name without a face, believed to have fled deeper into the Appalachian wilderness or to another remote haven. The case against him remained open, a lingering thread of unfinished justice. For Sheriff Brody, the resolution was bittersweet. They had found the Mitchells, uncovered the truth, and brought a measure of accountability. But the cost had been immense. He visited Ranger often. The dog, now permanently residing with Doc Simmons, who couldn't bear to part with him, seemed to sense the shift. The terror in his eyes had largely faded, replaced by a deep, quiet sadness, but also a new calmness. He no longer reacted with extreme fear to every loud noise, though he remained wary of strangers. When Brody sat with him, Ranger would often lay his head on the sheriff's knee, a silent acknowledgement of a shared ordeal, a bond forged in tragedy and truth. One crisp autumn evening, a year after the discovery at Raven Gap, Brody stood on the porch of his own small cabin, looking out at the vast, darkening silhouette of the mountains. The wilderness still held its secrets, its capacity for beauty and for darkness. But tonight, there was one less shadow, one less unanswered question haunting its depths. Ranger's loyalty, his impossible return, had been more than just a miracle. It had been a testament, a voice for the voiceless, a thread of courage that had led them out of a 2-year-long night. The truth had been exhumed, brutal and heartbreaking, but truth nonetheless. And in Harmony Creek, though forever scarred, the healing, like the slow turning of the seasons, could finally begin.